All right, good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the Farmington Board of Education meeting for Monday, October 1st, 2018. If we can please stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next item on the agenda, 5B, Fall 2019 Summative State Assessment Results.
So we're going to shift a bit from really inspiring recognition, such a role model for our students. Thank you so much, Michelle, to looking at our summative testing results for the 2017-18 school year. So I know Veronica Ruzic, Director of Curriculum and Instruction, will come up to the table. Assistant Superintendent Kim Wynn. They're going to provide an overview of the summative testing report that we do provide to the board on an annual basis. And again, it does reflect last year's results, but the results get released in September of 2018. So we received the results, and Veronica's just done an amazing job putting it all together for the board.
Okay, so I don't have a separate presentation for this because all the data is in the report that you've already received. But this really is an opportunity to go over the report and then to ask questions about it. And so we'll take it a little bit page by page. I think, should I just wait until I think people are filtering out? So I'm just going to take a second to.
So while people are filtering out, I do want to introduce, I have an intern this year, Tracy Peterson. She's here. So Tracy, do you want to just stand up for a moment? And you're going to see Tracy at board meetings, and she has been at different district meetings, and she will come with me on coaching days. And she's working on her 093 certification, which is a superintendent certification. So just welcome, Tracy. We're thrilled you're here. She is a principal in Windsor, an elementary principal in Windsor Public School.
Yeah. Okay, so just a couple of notes to get started, and then we'll go through it, and I'll highlight a couple of things that I think are, important things to know about this report. But as you remember, we've been doing the Smarter Balance for about 3 years now. We used to have the CMT and CAPT. Our students get tested in ELA and in math. And in the past, this report has also included a test of science, which is also the CMT and the CAPT. This year, we had a field test in the area of science, so there will be no results given either individually or to the district at all. There will be no results that are going to be shared with us. Those were tests that were given purely to test out the questions and for the state's information about how the students are doing, but they're not planning on sharing any of that data with us. One of the important also factors that the state looks at is participation rates, and you can see on page 5 in this report that our participation numbers are very high, and really, if any school were to get under a 95%, then this would play out then in our accountability report, where we would that school would be deducted an entire level. So there's 4 levels of achievement per school. So a school that achieved, the highest level will be bumped down bumped down an entire level. So you should see right there on page 5 that we do have high participation at all of our schools. So we're going to start with looking at the literacy. The literacy is really a test that's a computer adaptive test. So students are able to go as far as they can with the questions. So no two students see the same test. And it's all done on computers. So they sit next to each other, but it doesn't matter because nobody's getting the same kinds of questions. There used to be a performance task in the past. The performance task was taken out prior to last year. So last year already there wasn't a performance task, and that continued this year, that there is not a large performance task, which was a large writing assignment on it. So it's just basically one section, and it's untimed. So there's no, even though we have sort of parameters for how long it should take, and that 90% of our students would finish within that time, and we plan for that. We also know that some students are going to take longer, and they are able to do that. They're able to pause the test and go back to it and take as much time as they want, so that the score that they get is a true representation of what they know, rather than that they timed out on something. So those are some of the background notes about this assessment. So what you can see here are sort of the overall scores by grade, and we're only talking about 3 through 8. In grade 11, the students take the SAT. So they don't take the Smarter Balanced anymore, they take the SAT. And that was a change because we used to give Smarter Balanced assessment in the 10th grade for 1 year until then. Oh, actually, the 11th grade, they moved it to. So it used to be a 10th grade test, they moved it to 11th. But then it was seen as a year of a lot of testing, so they turned it into the SAT, which is a test that most of our students would take anyway. So this report really is only about the grades 3 through 8, and then the 11th grade reports are coming in a subsequent Board of Ed report, and Brooke Stanzial and Bill Silva will also be here to present that piece of it. So this is really a 3 through 8 report. So you can see here the literacy, and that gives you an idea of how we're doing, and it also highlights how the state averages are shaking out and sort of our difference between how we are doing compared to the state. And that's just the overall number of who meets or exceeds combined together. So you can see those percentages there. And if you look at, there's a line that says FPS overall right above the blue line that says state. So you can see that 80.3% of our students in those grades are meeting or exceeding the standard for that level, which is really 25% over state average. And then other notable, a really important notable point in that area is that we've been steadily increasing every year the number of students that are in that highest band. So we've had, you can see the history of that right there in the bulleted list, that from 42% several years ago to 49% of our students, which is almost 50%, are in the highest band. So over time, it looks like we're, making gains in the area of literacy. You can see that also on page 7 then. I try to provide a historical comparison because what happened was when we moved to this new test, we had been seeing some of our scores be quite high, like 90% of our students were making the targets at that time. But as this test was introduced, it was more difficult, more rigorous, and so then we started seeing numbers in the 70s, but I wanted to provide some context that really we're still exceeding the state by a wider margin than we have in the past, which to me indicates that we're doing better on this test. Even though sometimes the numbers may look lower than they had in the past, we're still outperforming the state by a wider margin. So actually on this test, which is more rigorous, we're actually de facto doing better than we have in the past on the CMT, which is what it was at that time. So you can see that both as a chart, as a table, and then sort of as a graphic. So you can see that we're outperforming the state by a wider margin. On page 8, this page gives you often people are interested in, okay, so how are we comparing not just to the state, but to the economic reference group to which we're compared. Currently we are in DIRG B. So there's a DIRG A and then DIRG B, and there's many socioeconomic factors that will place this town in a certain DIRG. So Currently, we're in DIRG B, although some of our data doesn't line up with the DIRG B. There's some places where I would say we're sort of over the averages of where DIRG B schools are, including our high needs group, and particularly free and reduced lunch has really grown over the past several years. So maybe we'd be in a different DIRG if the state recalculated, but currently we're still in this DIRG. But you can see even there that we're performing quite well, and the average, we're fourth in the DIRG, and you can see that listed there. So I know that that's an important sort of indicator that we try to sort of gauge what does this mean, where are we compared to other towns. So you can see that there. And then comparison of the schools in the ELA, and so you can see for third grade and fourth grade, the percentage of students who were at that 3 or above. So you can see that there. So that is really a lot of what we're talking about in terms of, comparing how we're doing to other districts and to the state. That kind of gives you an idea. In literacy on page 9, another way to represent the data is to show whether or not students are more of the students in that cohort meeting that standard over time. And so in ELA, the way you read this is that you look at the row and it says current fourth graders. Well, you're only going to see one score going across because they've only taken the test in the third grade. So you can see that 75% of our students met that. So then our current fifth graders, they've taken the test 2 times, once in third grade and then once in the fourth grade. And so you can see that the percentage of students who have met has actually increased. So then you can sort of reading across each line of that will tell you whether or not more students overall are meeting the 3 and 4 over time. So you can see that there. And you can see that really in all cases, even though there's ups and downs, in all cases here, anyway, it has more students are meeting the 3 and 4. And then this next part on page 9 is really interesting and really new to us. This actually was, if you looked back at your report from last year, this table would not appear in there. So I'm at the bottom of page 9. This would not have been in there because it was the first year they gave us any growth data. And so I think at the time, and we got it quite late last year, so we weren't really sure how to interpret it or really what to do with it. But we've really been looking at this, and it's very interesting. So now that all of the students are taking this Smarter Balanced, and it's based on a raw score that is based on a computer adaptive test that can move with the student's ability to answer the questions, it really means that students can be on a large range of thousands of points, so almost 3,000 points over time. And we can track it from year to year, how many points difference they're making from year to year on this raw score. And then the state provides us with a chart at the end of your packet. This is actually Appendix E. And the chart looks like this. And so what it tells you is that, for example, if a student is in grade 3 in year 1, now you can look at their range of how many scores, what score the student achieved. And that'll tell you how many points. So this is Appendix E. We're on Appendix E.
We don't have.
And it's actually, you don't have that?
No.
Oh, Appendix, sorry.
Right.
It's
We have
actually
up to,
We go up to
Appendix
C.
D.
Yeah, we go to
D?
B.
You don't have D and E?
No.
I go to B.
So if you had D.
We don't allow
or
anything
E,
below a C.
So if you had this, which I'm surprised that it's not there,
I think the color copier stopped at that point.
maybe it was giving him a.
Maybe Vince made it stop.
In any case,
not
there
like
is a
color
chart that the
copies.
state puts out. There's this chart that the state puts out that looks like this, and it says, okay, if you were scored in this range in the third grade, we would want you to make 82 points growth, and then if you made this, you need to get 60 points in order to meet the target for growth. Now, it's a very rigorous target that the state has set for students, and they only expect about 40% of kids to meet that rigorous target. So they're meeting, so it's a target, but they only expect 40% of students to actually make that target. So in light of that statistic, and truly I went back to the, all this information is on EdSite, which is the state's website. So I went back to see if that number is holding true for like state statistic. Is it about 40% of students that are making that growth target? And yes, it's about 40% of the students that actually hit their number that they're supposed to hit. But you can see in Farmington, this is on page 9, and it's the column before the last column, the one that says percentage who met target. And you could see that many more, even though those numbers don't look super high because you're like 67%, that doesn't sound so good. But given that the state really only expects 40% of the students to hit that target, that's a very high number. So that's a very high number of our students that are meeting the target. And then they wanted to make sure that people also got credit for how close students are making it to the target. So the final column is sort of that number, like the student was supposed to make, let's say, 80 points, but they made 40 points. So you would get 50% credit for that child. So that's an average of each student, how close they got to the number they were supposed to hit. That's an average. So for example, in Noah Wallace, 65.5% of students in ELA met that growth target. But overall, they were really close to, anybody who didn't make it must have been really close because the percentage of the target met is almost 87%. All right, so that's kind of how that works. And both those factors are big factors then in our accountability report that you see later in the year, where they sort of tell us how, how many of those points we've earned, where we sort of can see how we're doing on 11 different indicators. These are some of the indicators that they put into those numbers, into those accountability numbers. So you'll see these numbers again, just in our accountability report, because they'll say these will actually contribute a lot to our accountability numbers. And these are really good. These are really good comparatively. Like I was trying to say with that the state would only expect 40% of our students to have met those targets, and we're way beyond that. So really good, and it really helps us as a district, because now we can look at each student individually, and it's not just did you make it or did you not. So now a student who has a 1, in the past, oh no, a 1, oh, what are we not doing? Now we can say they're a 1, but they made 100% growth. So we can look back at what's that like, what have we done with that student? What made that happen? And now it's not such a dire sort of situation that the student's still at a 1. We actually have some indication of how much growth that student has made, and so that would help us know if the way that we're working with the child is helping or not helping. So really great indicator. And then on the flip side, we also have an indication. There are some students that are slide back, that actually on the raw score are not only not making any progress, but have actually gotten a lower raw score than they got the year before. Well, that's an indication to us too that something's going on. So this is just more data to help us understand what's going on with students and how to best serve them, make sure they're making the progress. If they're not, to strategize about what other kinds of supports can we put in for that student.
And Veronica, given our own internal assessments, don't we know if a student isn't making progress just by our internal assessments? I mean, this certainly is a summative, and it is a moment in time, and we pay attention to this, but we also have lots of
Yes.
other.
So we always triangulate. So we
Yeah.
have lots of we have in our system, we have something called an assessment data report, AD report, and we have lots of different kinds of indicators that would tell us this. But certainly, like you said, this is a summative, but the other data can sometimes tell us that, that it's an anomaly. Like maybe this score
Yes.
is the one that's the anomaly. So we certainly triangulate all the data. It's not the only indicator that we have, but certainly an important one that would make us go back. And then we say,
Right.
oh, that's a behavior thing. That's not a literacy thing, which sometimes it is. Like, and the other thing the state does for us now too is we're able to see if a student, how quickly they finish the test. So we can actually go back and say, well, the student finished in 20 minutes. Probably it was one of those like ABCD. This is not a good indication because it's on the computer. So there's lots of things that would go into analyzing where a student is, but it would be one factor that we'd be looking at. And especially if it does line up with what we already know, hopefully we're already doing some things to support the child. But when it doesn't line up with what we know, it still is an indicator of like what else is going on here. we'd still want to know then, like, why is this so out of the picture of everything else we know about the child? So, but again, you know, very strong results there. And then another place where a lot of emphasis by the state, and this again shows up in our accountability report, is how are we doing, especially a district like ours that traditionally does very well. They want to make sure that we're also, and we always have, but that we're also paying attention to how certain subgroups are doing. So they provide us with this kind of data. In fact, all this data is available on any district in the entire state on the edsite.gov. This is not some sort of private information. This is all publicly available on that site. And so, so they split it out this way. And then the big category that they really want us paying attention to is this high needs group, which is a combination of any one of these three factors would give the student this high needs flag. So either, it could be either and, I mean, it could be all three of them, but any one of these would do it. Students with disabilities, English learners, and free and reduced lunch. Those are the three indicators that then make up that final column of the high needs group. So anybody who qualifies for high needs, 52% of those students are meeting or exceeding the target, which again is a lot higher than the state number, but a lot lower than students that are not in that high needs group in our district. So you can take a minute there. So I'm going to stop there and then ask if you have any questions now about literacy. But if you'd rather that I move on and just, if you want to go more, I can just go on to the math and then save questions until the end. So I'll
Well,
kind of
why don't we just ask, any questions? You know, Veronica, you know, there's obviously a lot of data to digest, but if you had a bullet point, maybe one or two priorities you're pulling from this data, what would they be? Like,
I do think that we continue to, I mean, I see growth, so I feel like we are already responding to this kind of data and trying to pull that up. But I also think that, you know, as always, we're trying to really figure out what would help with the subgroups, because that's an important factor for us. As you know, I mean, it's in our core beliefs about equity, and so obviously we want to continue to move on that. But I would say that there's a lot of things to really celebrate in this. You know, we continue each year to get better. The gap between us and the state continues to improve. And as you saw, the number of students who are in that highest level continues to increase as well. So I would think that, although I think that the other thing is that we are doing more now with those growth numbers and making sure that we know who are those students, who's growing, what does that tell us? So those are some of the things that I know that we're talking about in our schools. And of course, there's some, you know, there's always those areas too where, you know, some of the results like from one school to another, we can't account for them, and they might look completely different than the next year, but for some reason that's like a cohort we need to have a spotlight on a little bit, and problem solve. Like, you know, we have common curriculum, how come in that one school we're seeing that kind of a result, and what happened there, and can we learn from each other, because we have some schools where it's very high, so what can we even learn within our own district to try to figure out what's happening there.
How much change are you seeing in the subgroups from year to year?
So it's hard to tell, and I'll tell you why. One of them, like for example, high needs, it was a nice jump, a big jump. But our high needs group, as I said before, really expanded. So over 2 years ago, we've had a 30% increase. So 2 years ago, we had in the low 300s of students in grades 3 through 8 that were identified as high needs, and mostly it's in this high, our English learners, you'll learn about that, has increased, but our students with disabilities, the percentage is about the same. It hasn't really increased like a tremendous amount that would make an impact. but our high needs group really grew from low 300s in those grades to almost 500 in just it actually happened over in a year. So it's hard to compare because that means you're sort of getting another 150 or so kids that had never been in that subgroup before, now in that subgroup. So it makes it a little bit hard to.
And so is this number, it still looks impressive against the state for those subgroups, even though we've had that much of an increase. Is this still measuring it against that 40% target?
No, so these are, no, because that's the growth stuff. These are the absolute results. So that means that in our district, for example, 85% of girls met a 3 or a 4 on literacy, but 76% of boys did. And that's a gap consistent with the state gap. So that 10% gap, you would see, you can see it right there,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that is the same gap.
Okay.
Which some years we've closed, it's been a lot closer, and this is sort of on the outskirts of what we would see. We've actually been closer in the past on that measure. And every once in a while, we re-look at that and look at what kinds of books do we have in our classroom libraries? Do we have enough things that would appeal to boys and all that? But it seems like we do that, we have a big push, and then a couple of years later, it's like, okay, let's revisit that and do that again because it had an impact and just a lot of priorities and a lot of things that we're doing that sometimes it needs like another laser-like focus on it in order to improve that result again.
And today's presentation by East Farm students was a good example of, boys being able to really focus on something they're interested in. And we know that when that happens, they will extend and they'll write a lot more and they'll be much more interested. So I think it's a great example of how we are trying to meet the needs of all students by making curriculum irresistible to boys and girls and also students in different subgroups too. So it was a nice segue to have this report, that presentation.
Quick question. Veronica, do you see at any point breaking down the high needs group for individual data with those 3 groups? Because those are 3 pretty distinct groups in terms of, the reduced price meals, kids who are eligible for that, English language learners, and students with disabilities.
Right, so we know who all the students are and which of those categories they fall under or whether they fall under more than one.
Right.
So.
But I mean, if we're getting a big influx of English language learners and our scores are going up with that increase, how are we measuring the data for, is it because of that group that the scores are going up, or?
So you see them, so you can see students with disabilities as their English learners, and the reason free and reduced lunch isn't there is because the state, it's sort of a hidden thing because, so even in our power school, a teacher couldn't easily access that because of privacy issues. So the state doesn't put it on there, and it's not even, it's not even visible on power school for teachers to see because it's private information. So that's why it's not broken out that way.
So there are ways to drill down to see where, like, I guess the increases are being made versus where you might have a group that's not.
Right, so
progressing.
if we're, so you mean year to year? So can I tell from, like a student with disabilities from the year before, like, is that a better number, the 29% than like maybe the year before or
Right,
something like
right.
that? That's all and publicly available, so definitely could. And I actually, like, for example, I have last year's data here on that to see if we're making progress, but I also compared it to so last year it was 25% for students with disabilities, and this year it's 29%. And for high needs, last year it was 43%, and this year it's 52%, for example. So we certainly have all that info and know all that. Also, we also know that for students who are not high needs, 90% of students meet the meets or exceeds, for example. So we know that there's 10% of students, so 1 out of every 10 students who does not fit into one of these categories still did not meet the 3 or the 4. So there's like lots of ways to slice and dice the data, and absolutely, but I would say that as it goes, like, for me, I'm giving you like an overall picture, but remember that at every grade level, every teacher has not only looked at the scores that their students have, including all this data, and who's grown and who hasn't, but they've analyzed it even for the students they had the year before, so that they can understand the impact of their instruction on those students. And they sort of, as a teacher, I used to teach AP classes at the high school. I sort of had I kind of had an idea of what students were probably going to get, just because I had so much data on every student, and we'd practice different kinds of questions. So I would already sort of know how the students would do. And then I couldn't wait until I got those scores, because I wanted to know, did my prediction, was it close to what I thought it was or whatever. So teachers are doing all that. They have, 20 students, 21 students, 24 students, whatever. They kind of have an idea. And then sometimes when they look at their, oh my gosh, what happened there? And then they dig, and then they communicate with the next year's teacher. There's literacy and math specialists involved in this whole process. So there's a lot of eyes on the students that either aren't making progress or aren't making the target, and people working very hard to problem solve, like, what can we do? But sometimes, it's like, you're a teacher, you're a 3rd grade teacher, you have a student that came in on a 1st grade level, they're still not at the target, but now as a teacher, you're like, wow, that kid really made so much progress. So it's just a better than where we've been in the past, in sort of, understanding our students as learners through this one test, to have a different kind of indication than just made it or didn't make it. Now we have all this other growth stuff too. So I would say, like, here, you're just going to get an overview, but I would tell you that at any grade level, those teachers really have a firm grasp of what's going on with their students and why the results came out like they did, and have theories about it, and have things in place to help them.
So you may have just answered this, but these were questions going on in my mind, because we have, and it might, Mark's question, you might have answered my questions, but we only have, we have 27 languages in the district. That
Yes,
said
we'll
that
get to that,
somewhere in
yeah.
here. We have 4 options here for race and ethnicity. So would these be the students, I mean, could they fall with, with the 27 different languages, could they fall all over the place between high needs, English
Correct.
learners?
Correct.
So that, what you just answered is how we sort of measure all those languages?
So the languages is an interesting one, because the students, even though in these numbers, you do know whether or not they're meeting it, but really then in our accountability number, they don't count towards our accountability for 2 years. So they want, if somebody comes in the day before the test is given, like really from another country with no English background, they're still required to take the test. And the state thinks this is helpful to us because we get a number, and then we can track the growth over several years. So even though the student may score a 1, then the following year we have a new number and we see how much growth they had. So all those students are in here, and we take that for what it's worth, because we know when the student entered the district, and so we could say, yeah, that student scored a 1, but they literally got off an airplane the day before, and they are in our system. But that number helps us, because then that's the baseline from which we're going to see growth, and it's not going to count towards our accountability for 2 years. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's just a kind of a special case. And certainly they fall out in different, like some of the students are going to be Asian, and some of them are going to be also maybe high needs because of a free reduced lunch potentially or whatever. So students fall into, all those different categories.
Christine?
So are you comfortable with the content of this test? Meaning, have we had to alter our curriculum in any way that you are uncomfortable with or more comfortable with, or what's the content?
So if I had, the option, I actually would have kept I like the performance task kinds of things, because I think they're more in line with our vision of the graduate. So for example, we want our students to be good critical thinkers and communicators, and I think that gave us some pretty good data about that. However,
They took that out of the ELA.
only out of ELA, so it's still in the
Only out
math.
of ELA.
It's still in the math, but they did take it out of ELA. And so what they state is that in English language arts, that we're getting, a look at these three areas, reading, listening, and then reading and research inquiry. Well, I don't think that yeah, so it's like reading, listening, and writing. So there's a lot of skills in there that I think are, when you read them, you do think, I would want my student to be able to, my child to be able to do these things. But really, I think that as a system, we would have been helped more if they had kept the performance task piece of it, and I would prefer that over this. But there are some, there are questions that require students to maybe listen to something they might, like a news story that they would see on the news, and then answer some comprehension questions, for example, of whether they understood it. So, I want every child to know how to do that kind of thing.
And I know you
So-
haven't done the presentation on math yet, but same kind of question. I mean, the content of the test, you don't feel like we have altered our
So,
level?
No,
or
but there are some times, what happens is, because we give the test, in April, so there's some concepts that are fifth grade concepts that really weren't covered yet. Or, for example, there are years where we notice things like they did an awful lot of elapsed time questions. Well, that wasn't a big focus, so it wasn't in there. So there have been times when we've changed the sequence of things, not necessarily the standards, because the standards, we know that those belong in that year, but we could guess wrong, and then the next year, that's not emphasized.
Got
So sometimes it's a little bit tricky to sort of try to guess what's going to be on the test, but those are certainly things that come up, and I always ask, like, after the assessment, we have enough people that are proctoring it, so they're around, so they kind of have a sense of what some of the kinds of questions are, and they'll say, ooh, just so you know, a lot of elapsed time questions, and we didn't get to that yet in the 6th grade, and those were the kinds of questions that were on there, and certainly, they make it sound like those are ones that we would have eventually gotten to, but the kids might not have seen that quite yet. But, they do go along with the standards. I mean, I've seen some examples of totally ridiculous questions that, people will post on Facebook and say, oh, this is the kind of test. I don't find that to be representative. Those are the kinds of questions that I see as, that's not really what the test is about. Could you find some that are a little bit like, why did they ask that? That's a silly question. There's definitely examples of that. But I wouldn't say the majority of the test is that.
Thank you.
In math, I'm going to move on then to the math, and on page 11, again, you see those scores, and this is really, again, all very good news in terms of how our students are doing, and to have almost 50% of our students on a pretty challenging test with a performance assessment. To be in the level 4 band is very high. So you can see all those scores there. And again, outperforming the state by even a greater margin than we do in literacy. So our math is particularly strong. And I do attribute that to our Math and Focus program, because that has built that strong real number sense of students, and many districts that compare themselves to us are kind of wondering how we've done it with the math and are adopting similar programs.
There was no data there.
So there's no data in those blacks.
This is blacked out. I just
Yeah,
wanna make
because
sure.
you comparing, so that was only important. So it shows you how we compare to that. So if you read across, so Chrissy's asking about why that would be blacked out. So
Sorry, I was
it's
just
only in
making sure,
FPS
'cause
data, it's just to give you that number.
We don't have color, so I just want to make sure.
Oh, you don't have color.
We don't have color, so I just want to make sure I wasn't missing something.
Yes,
Thank
no,
you.
no, no.
Sorry.
So those are blacked out, right?
Yep.
And then, again, you can see that compared to the state, outperforming the state by a wider margin, although it looks in 2016, it was an even wider margin, but we're creeping back up towards that number in terms of And that's just to give you a sense, that was really originally so that you would see that even though before our numbers like had looked higher, really we're still outperforming the state by an even wider margin. And then you can see the cohort analysis in math on page 13. And there you can see that what I was talking about in literacy actually is not holding up, right? So it almost looks like, except in the 9th grade, that, you know, it starts off higher when they were in the 3rd grade, and then whatever grade that they're in now, except, well, I guess the 5th grader, current 5th graders too. So that's something to pay attention to all over time, but you can see that kind of sometimes dips up and down. But the 9th graders, that was a cohort that we were really worried about in the 5th grade. Remember, that was a year, that was the first year, and our students, 49% of them made the 3 or 4, and we were worried because we had made that switch in the math and focus. But you can see over time that they've made up for that gap. So you can see that that's,
Yeah,
has really
that
increased
group
over
switched
time.
in 3rd grade. It was
that
a
was
struggle.
why, but you can
Are we-
see, so that was,
We
that's
know,
a.
we have the age group.
Yeah,
They did.
so that was a year that we were paying particular attention to over time and knew that we had to do some things to fill in those gaps. And you can see that over time that we've been able to achieve that. And then the next chart on page 13 is also a growth analysis, but now in math. But there you can see like really high percentages of students who are meeting the target. Very, very impressive numbers. The only place, and people know about this at West District School, but West District School, that we're only talking about the 4th grade because you only have growth from 3rd grade to 4th grade. So there is that one cohort. So while West District does very well on the overall, now am I missing a page? On the overall numbers, this is strange. 13. Oh, no, it comes later, the comparison in math on page 15. So I can get back to that, but you can see that the students at West District are doing very well in the math, but then the growth then suffers. So they do so well in the 3rd grade that then when they go to the 4th grade, the growth numbers don't kind of hold, even though they're doing very well. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind there, although that is certainly, nobody's satisfied with that number, and you can be sure that they're working overtime at West District School to address that number right there. And then 14, similarly, you can see how we compare in the DIRG. 15 shows you how we're doing in the elementary schools compared. And again, you can see there that really Union is an outlier school. But their growth tells us, because their growth there, they're meeting the target at 75%, so they're not making those absolute numbers, but their growth is very close. So they're making good progress in those. And then you can see in the subgroups, again, how our students are doing there. And again, very impressive numbers in our subgroups, and actually doing a little bit better with English learners, which I think you would expect maybe, because math and versus literacy, that they're doing a little bit better there. But even just the high needs overall, 46. Oh, actually, what did we say it was on the other one? I almost thought it said, I think of in literacy, yeah, 52. So in high needs, it's 46. So actually a little bit worse than literacy, but English learners do a little bit better than they do on literacy, which makes sense there. So that's our subgroups. And then just a couple of highlights and implications. So again, basically this is some of the things that I've said that are, our growth is very high, our subgroups are outperforming, what the state averages are. Our scores in math and ELA really are strong, compared to over time and compared to the state, and we're high up in a DIRG, and potentially a DIRG that our numbers don't actually line up to that DIRG so much anymore. So given those sort of, that sort of context, I do think that we're doing a lot in order to stay competitive with the DIRG B schools that have much different numbers than we do. For example, in Avon, their high needs group is, I guess I'll have to look it up just to make sure that I'm right, but it's in the low teens. And we're in like the mid-20s in terms of our high needs population percentage-wise. That's a big difference. And we're like holding our own with districts like that, which is just to give you a little bit of like background context to it of how this town, is changing, and we continue to do a lot to keep ourselves in the mix with that. So I'll take any other questions you have. There's actually a page 2. You have the comparisons of how we're doing overall in the DIRG, but the appendix C shows you grade by grade. So if you were interested in that, you can see grade by grade where we fall out. So I know you asked a lot of questions, maybe even all of the questions at this point that you wanted to ask, but I certainly answer any other questions now you may have about math or really anything.
Yep, Mark?
Just looking at the state percentages between male and female, seems like math is usually a stronger place for boys.
Yeah.
It seems like in both categories, boys are falling behind where the girls are. Wondering what the plan is to close the achievement gap.
Yeah, isn't that interesting too? I mean, in the state, that's the sort of the closest that gap has ever been to. So the 47 and the 46, you're right, it usually looks different in the favor of boys. I wonder too whether, a lot of the math now, there is also a lot of reading that goes along with it, and these performance tasks particularly. So I do wonder whether it's actually related to literacy, and that's why that's happening.
Probably, if I'm going by my house.
Right, so I do think that is something that we certainly know about. It's funny because we've always been trying to close the gap for the females in this category traditionally, although we've always, for the past several years, our females and males have been more sort of neck and neck on this indicator, even when the state was like more heavily, like more males were on that, but it's interesting that now it's actually swung the other way. But I think it might be related to the literacy, but.
Well, I know that's how they do it for the test, but the test doesn't end up on their transcript. So is this like something the school is doing in terms of overall in its curriculum, or is this just based on what the SBAC test teaches, or the SBAC is test that they take? So how they phrase the questions on the SBAC, is that how we're teaching in the curriculum overall?
Oh, yeah, so that's a good question. So when we think it's good.
I know that, I see how the numbers translate here. I'm just wondering, is that translated?
So here's the
to
thing. So we
scores?
don't teach to the test. So you're not going to go into a class and say, okay, now we've stopped everything and we're doing smarter balanced prep. But what we do, and we've been doing more now that, at first you don't know what the test really is going to be about or all that. So what we have been doing, though, is doing things like, and every year we sort of do a little bit more to understand it a little bit better. So in ELA, for example, we've taken all of their types of questions. We've sort of figured out, they sort of have easy, medium, hard questions, and we've categorized the stems that they use, and then we integrate them into questions into problems that we are already doing. So we don't add new things, but and not only that, but we do it because teachers have looked at it and they like it. They're like, oh, that's like a good way of phrasing that. So when we like it, we take it. If we don't like it or don't think it's valuable, we don't use it. We just would say, like, that's not really like what we're really about or what we're aiming for, so we wouldn't do that just for the sake of doing it. But for some,
Not to interrupt you, but
yeah.
the correlation between our math scores at the schools overall, like grade-wise, apart from the test, are we seeing a similar trend in terms of data as far as would these scores match how we see our kids performing on their report cards the scores that actually go towards on their transcripts? Is there a correlation between the two?
I haven't done an analysis with scores, although certainly students who, anytime I've looked at sort of a student who, they can actually max out on a number on the like, for example, math. Those are students I've always noticed do get A's. But remember, it's only 7th and 8th grade we're talking about. All the other levels have exceeds meets near and below. So we're only talking about in 7th and 8th grades, you could do that sort of analysis. And as Kathy said, this is just one, there could be many explanations sometimes for why a student scored this way that wouldn't correlate to the score. So you'd have to like sort of triangulate the data and see.
I don't think we've seen a gender gap in our local assessment data, though, that's been noticeable.
I would just be interested in seeing if there's
Yeah.
data out there to, size up, see how much the test varies from what we're doing as a school.
But you'd also have to
The test
know-
has certain questions that are asked. So I'm just wondering if this gap is just the test or is it district-wide?
Right, I mean, yeah, and you'd have to look too at, I mean, again, you can go into a long conversation about what makes up a grade to what's included in a grade, because, there's lots of reports about how a better indicator is like what usually correlates as actually like a final exam or a midterm exam, not necessarily a student's grade in the course in most places because of the way that grades are calculated.
Right.
So, I mean, so there'd be a lot of things then to talk about why that happens if it didn't line up. There could be a lot of factors there. But also just to go back to the idea of how this is impacting us, like certainly the performance task in math, we really like. I mean, we think that that's really good. So we do have for performance tasks at every grade level in math because we feel like it measures critical thinking and communication. So we do, like I said, when we think the assessment practice is a good assessment practice and gives us some information that we're interested in, it certainly does work its way into our curriculum, and we make sure that then the students are familiar with those types of questions or those kinds of prompts or what they're going to see when they get to that assessment.
Well, I think the data would be good also, just because even if we're looking in the subcategories in other areas, is this just indicative of the test or how the district is doing? So, I mean, you could probably run it against every category to see, is it how the questions are being phrased? Because if we're not prepping for the test, and the test is what the test is, and the kids are sitting to take the test, then that's just a snapshot based on what they've sent to us. I'd be interested to see how our district lines up with the test, just to see if it follows the trends that the test scores are showing versus, hey, maybe the test is just an outlier based on what they're providing versus what we're doing here.
Right, so that's
We
really
might
your
be
question,
performing
like,
better.
is this indicative, is this an outlier if we were to look at?
Right, how much
other
stock do we
data
put into these
points?
results if we're not completely teaching to this test?
Right, but we do things like, so for example, you'll see when we do our results and outcomes test, results of, we have something called recurring performance tasks, and in math, it is, for example, the performance task that looks just like the performance task they'll see. Those numbers do line up. What we get there lines up very closely to how the students are doing on this math assessment, for example. So there are certain other, so I don't know about how grades per se would line up, but certainly some other data points that we have in the district do line up that we know. And it's hard because we're always trying to improve that. So we get that data so that then we can use that internally in order to improve the results that we see on here. So when we see that there's some sort of, something that students don't understand, then we certainly don't let it sit. We try to.
Right.
We try to.
I mean, to drill you too hard, but I'm just,
Yeah, no.
want to make sure, because people say all the time, are you teaching to the test or you're not teaching to the test? How are things going? There's a lot of prep goes into this test. There's a lot of time people sit for this test. I mean, you get 180 days of school and you got 5 or 7 of them dedicated to the test. That takes away from time that the kids are learning, and people just want to know, hey, how much are we in line with the test or varying from the test?
Right.
This is a big question that comes up every April. So it might be good if we had something to show, like, where are we in terms of our own district
But
versus the.
I know, but okay, but what I think I'm saying is that we don't do what traditionally people would think as test prep for this test. I think that when we think of practice are
No, when I say
good,
it's like
we
practicing the
integrate-
system, making sure everything works, things like that.
Oh, that takes very little time because our students are, as you know, on Chromebooks all the time. So like our math assessments, many of them are already on a platform, our own platform, not this same platform. But we've replicated some of the ways that not only do they ask the question, but the actual mechanics of using the computer to do that. So we do those kinds of things, but certainly you want kids to be prepared for the test, but I don't think anybody would walk into a classroom and say they're doing test prep. It's just the way that we're assessing them ourselves. So I think that's just test prep is just a difficult one because I think people have an image in their head that we're stopping all curriculum and now we're just like getting ready for this test. We just take the good pieces of this test that can help us and we integrate it into what we were already doing and try to use that to enhance what we were already doing.
And I think, Mark, maybe this might be analytical or from an analytics perspective, apples and oranges. You're trying to assess the student's performance, take those numbers in the classroom day to day, and then these numbers, and they may not be easy to mesh together. They're just maybe different things. But Ellen?
No, and you've given us a lot of information and really answered Mark's question, which is interesting, Veronica. So you can feel free to answer yes or no to this, but do you feel the Smarter Balance assessment tests are a good reflection of, say, our 7th and 8th grade math students?
So our 7th and 8th grade.
Well, just to Mark's question, do you think that these assessments are a good reflection of are you comfortable with the information and feel that's a good reflection of our students?
So
That's sort of basically, I think, what you wanted to know.
I would say-
Yeah, it's a good
Does
question.
it line up with the test?
It is.
I would say that we have some internal indicators and especially these performance tasks that do line up with that number, and you'll see those in our results and outcomes book, and we're always thinking like, how can we increase that number? But I would say that does. Now, does it line up with grades? No, because a lot more students are getting A's than 70%.
So if we see an achievement gap somewhere, we can change it in a direction we want to go, even if it doesn't line up with the SBAC.
Yes, we would look at our internal data and take action steps to meet the needs of that child. So we have lots of indicators prior to this assessment that would say that child is not meeting grade level standards in particular areas, learning targets, and we would intervene. The SBA is aligned to Connecticut's core standards. We align our curriculum to Connecticut's core standards, but we also have another overarching, item that gets integrated into our curriculum, which we heard this evening, our vision of the graduate. So we do hold our students to a higher standard with that vision, which, the board created with the community and has been working on for the past 8 years. So I think that we definitely have a much richer curriculum for our students, a curriculum that provides a lot of choice for our students, which makes it a lot more interesting for our students. But we absolutely ensure that the Connecticut core standards are covered within our curriculum. So I feel that we prepare our students for this assessment, but this assessment is one assessment. And it is part of a body of evidence for each of our students. We pay attention to it, especially a Board of Ed should pay attention to results because it's one of the few tests we can compare ourselves to other districts. And so, it's something you want to keep your eye on, but I don't want to overemphasize a test like this because then we wouldn't be doing the good work that you saw earlier tonight with our students if we were just so focused on those assessments, only that. So does that help, Mark, at all?
It does. Obviously, my concern is the achievement gaps. So
Yes, absolutely.
really just, how we're planning to go forward with that. And, I won't berate the question again, so.
Yeah, no,
Just add a
I would definitely
More of a
expect
point,
the
I
board
guess.
to question
Right,
the achievement gap. It's something that we work on for Renee and teachers who are here in the audience. We look at data constantly. We're constantly evaluating where students are on an individual basis, putting interventions or actually challenge in place for students, because we want students to feel challenged if they already have met particular standards. But we have asked this board for lots of resources relative to the gap and putting things in place like additional reading teachers, ELL tutors, ensuring that we have adequate resources for our special needs students when it comes to the number of faculty available to provide those supports. So the achievement gap, we have a core belief equity matters, and it's something that really drives the work in Farmington. We've always been proud of our focus on equity, but we're not there. We need to continue this work, and we do want to close those gaps. So it's an appropriate concern as far as a board of education, and we come to you on an annual basis and ask for additional resources when we see that in a particular area we're not meeting the needs of a particular group of students. We want to make sure that we have adequate resources to meet the needs of every child in the district. And I know, Kim, I interrupted you. So
No,
I don't know if you
I think I was interrupting you. I just, some of the takeaways for us when we have these moments in time when we can reflect and think about what's working, what could we do better. One of those areas of our thinking right now is as much as we know some students need very specific interventions and very specific instruction, we're realizing that that's best done right inside the core curriculum.
Yes.
And so we're beginning to think differently about, pulling students out for intervention, but rather I think you've been hearing about flex time and other ways where intervention is more integrated right within the core. So keeping children as much as possible within core instruction so they're always, being a part of the challenging work of the classroom and not, being spoon-fed little, bit by bit helpful instruction, but disconnected from the core. So we're thinking about there are times when students need very intensive support, but we're wanting to be very thoughtful about how often that happens and make sure kids are connected to the, the rigors of the regular classroom. And then along with that comes the idea that we need all of our teachers to be highly skilled in literacy and math. So our special education teachers are very skilled in some of the interventions they provide, but they need to be sure that they're always in tune with and connected to the regular classroom so that their expectations for students don't begin to get kind of off focus because they're with a particular group of students all of the time. So that's another kind of takeaway learning, is always keeping our specialized experts, talking to each other and understanding what everyone is doing so that that high level of learning is always there. And then just the last thing actually I have two more quick things. One thing is that we're noticing that as students come to us in math from other districts and other places in the world, that, the curriculum, there's a greater mismatch of curriculum and learning experiences. So we're struggling with how to close that bigger gap.
Almost like a different gap thing. Like
Yeah, it's like
how
a
many years in the
different-
district kind of gap?
Yeah.
That nobody.
Yeah, like you're coming to us with what looks to us like 3 or 4 years behind in learning in this curriculum area. So we're trying to figure out how can we do that? What's the best way to close that learning gap? Not that the child can't learn, but they just haven't been exposed to curriculum at that level. So, and then finally, the other thing, another kind of takeaway for us has been a greater emphasis on academic vocabulary in the classroom. So getting all children to not use those shortcuts and teachers to not use those shortcuts in describing their thinking or their vocabulary about mathematics or their vocabulary about being readers and writers. and in making sure that we're expecting children to finish their sentences and say what they're trying to say articulately, using the vocabulary that's necessary, because we're seeing that that makes a difference in their expressions of understanding as well. So I just, those are just a few things that occurred to me as Veronica was talking and as you were asking the questions about how does this impact our curriculum moving forward, our professional development moving forward, how seriously do we take these results, and how do they triangulate with what we already know about children?
So certainly, we are working towards, we want all students to be able to meet these rigorous expectations, but you can see that all the indicators, and when we compare ourselves to other districts, and when we compare ourselves sort of over time, when we compare ourselves to the state, even in a subgroup analysis, when we look at the growth numbers, there's a lot to celebrate there. There's a lot of positives, so I think that overall it's a story that, as we're getting better, and then I think a lot of your questions were like, should we care about even getting better at this test? Like, are these the kinds of things we want our kids to do? And I'd say yes, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we strive for.
Okay, any additional questions? Well, Veronica, Kim, thank you very much for that. It's a lot to digest, but it's always good to have the empirical benchmark data for us to do what we want to do with it. So I appreciate all the efforts, and thank you for going through that. Okay, next item on the agenda, 5C, ELL programming.
So another appropriate segue. So this report I know will be of great interest to the board. Given the increase of students in Farmington requiring English language learning programming, we felt it was a good time to provide an update to the board and possibly do this every other year or even every year, depending on what the board would like. And I really do want to commend Veronica and Nicole for their work. A couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Veronica took over this area, and she has really worked collaboratively with Nicole and the ELL faculty and staff. I mean, just has done a tremendous job, and it was at the right time because we then received this big increase in population. So even though we didn't have a crystal ball, I think we made the move at the right time for Farmington.
I don't think we have the report. in the
Yeah, I don't see
packets.
that.
It's before the other.
It's before.
Before the one.
It was
It's
out
before
of-
the assessment
yeah,
one.
yeah.
They were out of
It's
order.
there.
It's right after the agenda or the minutes, right at the top.
Yeah.
Right after the minutes.
Keep going. There you are.
Thank you.
So Nicole's going to come up to present this report with me.
Welcome.
It was nice of you all to find the report, but all of our numbers have changed since you saw it. So this is kind of good that you see that this is a sort of a moving target kind of thing, but we also have an October 1 report. So the numbers that I have today, and I copied them and I left them on the printer in my office, but they're close enough that I can just tell you a couple of things, and it'll still make sense. But know that Mary tomorrow will send you the most up-to-date report, and then she'll update the board packet that's online.
And the reason for the change, even from last week, is that this is when we're testing students.
Exactly.
And so it's an ongoing process at the beginning of each school year.
Exactly. So we can describe that a little bit. And so I'm just going to introduce, so Kathy made reference to Nicole, but this is Nicole Katoya. And several years ago, we were able to hire a teacher. We've always run the program with tutors, but you could see on one of these pages that our program has really expanded, so we needed a teacher. So we have a .4 teacher at the high school who teaches sheltered ESOL classes. But Nicole is a 0.7 teacher, so she's not even, I mean, when you see the list of things that she does and you hear her, you're going to know. Like, it's just not, I don't have her enough, but she does more than you would ever expect somebody who is an 0.7 FTE to be doing. And we've really introduced a lot of new services and programs for students and for their families over time. So she really helps, actually K-12, mostly K-8, but actually a lot of K-12 because we have a new teacher in that position. So she's been helping out with that. So anyway, so Nicole and I will both sort of present this report. I might do a lot more of the talking, but she'll be here more for like any kinds of questions that you may have. So as Kathy said, we've really grown in this area. And so really, you should just know that Farmington is a very diverse town. When you look at our students, so of our students, over 700 of them have a primary language in Power School other than English. 700 of the students here. So that means that they're not all identified ELL. They don't need that. They might be a student like I was. I have a different, English was not my first language, but I never had services, that kind of thing. So we have 700, more than 700 students actually. I think it's around 740 students that speak a different, that have a different primary language. Our students, so then how can we tell out of those 700 who are the students then that need the services? There is something called the Last Links Placement Test. So every year we test the students who come in that have answered on, there's a home language survey that, that people who are registering in town need to fill out about their child, and it has 3 questions on it. So one question is, what's the primary language of the child? What language is spoken by the parents in the home, and what was the first language that the child learned? If any one of those 3 is something other than English, then that student comes to our attention. We have a list, and now we do digging. So we look at historically where the student came from. Did they have services there? What do we know about the child? Or if we can't figure that out, or we know that they don't have any of that background, they just came from another country, we test them on something called the Lost Links Placement Test. We have to do that process with about 180 students at the beginning of every year, which is why Kathy said that we're still in the process, although we set a goal that by October 1st, that we will be sort of complete with that process of trying, like, over the new students. So we've gone through those over 180 students this year and have determined, and here it said 30 are newly identified, but I think we're closer to 40 or 40, so a little bit over 40 actually, students out of those 180 that have been identified newly by us. We know that because last year, so we had students last year that carried over from last year. So even though 50 students tested out last year based on a Lost Links test given by the state in a January through March window, 50 tested out, but we still retained 115 in the program. And as of this morning, even though it says 142 in here, we have 155 students. So that's the 40 students that are newly identified in the district out of the approximately 180 that we had to look at based on the home language survey. So on this first page, it tells you the numbers by school. So each one of those has really increased by 2 or 3, except for Union. Union's still at 10, but Noah Wallace is 27, West District 25, East Farms 50, different numbers than you have there, but you get the gist that it's kind of close. Westwood's up to 20. Irving Robbins actually went down by 1. There's a story behind that, but it went down by 1, and then Farmington High School is still at the 15. So that kind of gives you an idea of, if you had questions about which schools are these students, that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. The West District surprised us a little bit. That's sort of that's a little bit out of their norm, that kind of spiked up. We've always considered East Farms to have the most, and then Noah Wallace sort of behind that. And so to have 27 at Noah Wallace and then 25 at West District was sort of a surprise to us this year. So you should just know that that was kind of unexpected. And so I'm sure you'll get a report from Kathy by Friday that says that we've done a little bit of hiring in this area for more tutors because we needed more support. We do try to have a little bit of a calculation for how many hours, whether a student's a newcomer versus somebody we've had for a while, about how many hours of service that we say that students would get, and that helps us determine how many hours of service we need at a school, which helps us understand how many people we should be hiring in those positions. On the next page, you can see how they fall out over grade-wise. So you can see that we have a concentration in grades K and 1 really are the highest grades of where our ELL learners are, which makes sense. They've newly come to school. They haven't had a chance to really be sometimes with other students. Some of them have had preschool, but not always. So you can see the numbers there. And so like why third grade is sort of higher, not in the teens, in the 20s, I'm not really sure why that happens, but it could be, when people move in, maybe. We also know that there's a lot of people who first move to the country and don't know quite where they come in based on where maybe other people that they know of have moved to. And so, Rocky Hill, for example, is a district that we've noticed that a lot of students move here from Rocky Hill. And then it's sort of like, they move to Rocky Hill, find out that Farmington is known for its really good schools, and then try to make it here, which may be something that happens around the third grade, something like that. So it's possible that some of those kinds of factors are contributing to why you see a spike there. But generally, a student that we've had for 2 to 3 years, generally, not always. I can give you examples of students we've had in the program for 7 years and are still in the program. Often they have other needs. So maybe they have special education needs. That's how they got in the program. That really the language wasn't the issue, but because they can't pass the last screener, now they're categorized as ELL. And we happily provide some services for the language piece of it, but also with the knowledge that maybe they're not going to test out of it. So sometimes we have those cases. But generally, if a student's in for more than 4 years, we start saying, what's the reason for that? Because by now we would expect that a student would be able to test the last. But we also have an interesting thing that goes on. Sometimes we have students that can, speaking of Smarter Balance, they can meet literacy on Smarter Balance and still can't meet the last test, which you would think that could never happen because you would think that that is more rigorous than the LAS. But we had more cases than the state had ever seen last year. They were sort of surprised at how many students were meeting the ESPA but still not meeting the LAS. So it's sort of an interesting phenomenon of that could happen. As Ellen referenced before, 27 different languages. I love that one of them on your list is English. There was one student on there. No idea how that happened. We have a lot of students who speak English, but there is. I don't know how that makes absolutely no sense. But since then, the numbers have changed a little bit. So slightly, like for example, Polish, 2 other additional students, but Spanish, which quite frankly, has not been our number one language. It's generally some sort of, some sort of Asian country languages, like sort of the Mandarin has always been very high, Telugu is another one that's been high. But this year, Spanish, we have 20 students. So this is 16 here. But as of this morning, we have 20 students that Spanish is their primary language. And then we have another language. So it still is 27, even when you cross out English, because we have a student who speaks a language called, how do you say it?
Kannada.
Kannada. Okay, so one student who speaks that language. So it still is 27 different languages in terms of our ELL population. So it's hard to say, it's so many different languages that certainly our tutors don't speak these languages. So we use, especially when they're newcomers, There's a big need for us using technology the best we can to communicate with the families and with the students. And there have been a lot of advancements in technology over the past several years that help us start working with these students. Because it's really a lot of languages there. It's interesting, I mean, very diverse. On the next page, you can see how the program has grown over time. So like I said, as of this morning, that 142, you can just go ahead and cross off. That's no longer true. As of October 1st, which this will be in our October 1 report, I'm sure, but 155. So 155 this year.
I should probably mention that it grows over time too throughout the year.
Oh, and that's an October 1 number, which is kind of consistent with what other numbers here are. But by the end of the year, we're likely to be above that. So last year we started at 154. By the end of the year, we were at 163. So 9 additional students by the end of last year. And I suspect that the same thing could happen. It could happen this year. One of the trends we're seeing, though, is that we seem to be getting more newcomers. So you can see there, it says English learner newcomers, which means that when they test, they're at levels 1 and 2. So there's been an increase in the number of students that we would categorize as newcomers. There's some there. I can answer questions about it, but mostly it's staffed by tutors, and we're especially grateful and lucky to have the people that we have. We have many people who are actually certified teachers who are not looking for full-time teaching positions and are able to be here for the hours when we want them. And to Kim's point before, when she was talking about how we're trying not to do so much pull-out, we try to do a lot more push-in, because we know when a student gets pulled out, they may have a half-hour intervention, but they might be pulled out of a 90-minute block that they never feel like they can get back into. And so we've wasted a lot of time with that student, where they now have sort of lost the thread of what was going on in the class, and that extra hour might be wasted because of that. So we've really been concentrating on giving people the training to be pushing in. What could that look like? And so we try to do, of course, if it's somebody who's a newcomer, sometimes you need to take them out to just some foundational English kinds of lessons that they need to do. But generally, we've been trying to push into classes. So what that might look like, so an interesting one, for example, is, speaking of technology being able to help you, we have something called Draft Back. So we're able to link up to a student's writing piece, and then we can watch the student in a sped up version of how they typed it, and we can watch, so all of our ELL tutors are trained in how to watch that screen and then see how that student is writing and where the student gets stuck, because it'll show you for a long time, like the kid didn't do anything, they didn't write anything. And so then our tutors are trained to be able to now be in the class, know where the student gets stuck in writing, for example, and sit next to them and say, you know what, I noticed that you really get stuck when you have to come up with your reason. So maybe together, or we can come up with a little graphic organizer that'll help you come up with your 3 reasons, or whatever the paper might be, and then I'm going to let you go. So just that scaffolding, so they can sort of analyze a little bit where the problem is, go in, provide a little bit of scaffolding, but always our goal is to get away from the scaffolding. So we give them scaffolding, but then we try to say, okay, now can they now transfer that and do it themselves on the next paper? Because we don't want it to become cemented that they need us for everything. So our goal is always as much pushing as we can, a little bit of scaffolding, and then removing the scaffolding as soon as possible. And so you can see here just some of the areas. We do a plan for every student. We say, these are the scores, so we can give it to the teacher. And so we propose that we're going to work, and we have a little checklist, and we're going to mostly be working on these kinds of things with the student in these kind of categories based on what we know about the student, and it's in negotiation with the teacher. So we have a test score, but also this teacher has some knowledge of that student, so we work with the teacher to say, these are the things that we think would be most helpful to provide for the student. So if you move to the next page, the one after sort of this one that gives a little update of like our services, one of the things you'll notice is that we've been working really hard on engaging these students and their parents in the community. This is a feature that the program never had before. You know, students maybe got some interventions, but we've really emphasized parent nights, getting parents to come in. So things that you wouldn't maybe think of, like how do you read a report card? So we do that. And why literacy in any language is important. I think in the past, there's been a lot of, you know, you're an immigrant and you should just switch languages and always speak English. And that's actually a detriment to our students. So we've been emphasizing, no, just read. Literacy in any language, that builds that part of their brain, and that's really important. So we show parents, like, these are some strategies that we use in the Farmington Public Schools for reading, and we give them little cards. Like, these are the kinds of questions you could be asking, and you could do it in any language. Just read together and read. And so you can see a list. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see it's quite a lot of services above and beyond just tutoring that we do in the class. There's a lot of things that we've been trying. And to make people feel not only included, but welcomed. Like, we want to give we want to make sure that people know that, like, we see these 27 languages in our district as a great benefit to our students, that they're getting exposed to all sorts of cultures without even having to leave their own school. And we think that that's awesome, and it provides for a lot of different viewpoints and understandings and discussion that really it helps all students. So we really try to do a lot to encourage this idea that that this is a welcome challenge that we have to have all these students. So one of the things I want to show you is that we've also been trying, I hope the sound is going to work on this, but we also try to do, and why don't you describe a little bit what you did with this? Because it was really sort of a brainchild of this kind of thinking. How can we teach students English, make it fun? So go ahead and give a little backdrop and I'll play it.
So this club came out of a need for some students to be involved in Westwoods. We had like 5 or 6 students last year that just kind of came in the middle of the year. It was probably around November, and they spoke no English. They were from all different countries, and we really started to notice, like, they didn't seem overly integrated into the schools. They weren't coming to, like, events outside of school. We weren't seeing a huge language growth in their classrooms. Some of them were having behavioral problems. So we really wanted to say, what can we do to involve these students in our school and make them feel like a part of our community? So Alicia Bowman and Veronica and I sat down and we talked about their needs, and we came up with this club. And so Sabrina Deshevsky, the Spanish teacher over at Westwoods, and I facilitated this club. And the idea was just that when students are learning English, they're not going to necessarily learn it like we learn Spanish or French in our classes. They're going to learn it by being around their friends, and when they're not nervous or stressed out or feeling on the spot, that's when all the language is going to come. So this club was all about, socializing and coming together, but they didn't really realize that they were learning so much language during the club.
Right, so it was about playing games, and it wasn't only ELL students that were involved, but we asked students, actually we had students from the high school involved, and then students who were native English speakers that were in the club. So here's the sound. Should there be talking already?
No.
Okay.
Now there should.
Now there should. So, any ideas?
Yes, Veronica, open up the
Yep.
case there, and see I turned on the light. You might want to increase the skill.
Here we go.
So I was like, this club was very fun because it has many fun things to do and very creative. So I was like glad because it was fun, and then I made friends. I like it because you have like more friends in
did a lot of fun stuff that I found engaging, and there were pretty much everyone was doing them outside of school, and now we got to do them in school, so it was really fun.
Well, this club was super fun because you got to meet a bunch of people of different origins and learn about people, like how they are, and learn through that through play. And also the games that we did there, super fun and engaging. Like it almost felt like the end of the day was like, oh, we're in recess. That was super fun and cool.
I chose to help out with this club because I think it's really important for students, especially young children, to have like confidence, like having friends that speak English, even if they don't really speak it fluently. It just helps them socially, and when they grow up, they just feel comfortable in the country.
So I chose to participate in the ELL club and help out because as English not being my first language too, I thought it would be interesting and helpful to help those also who English is not their first language and who struggle with the language, because I know that English can be pretty difficult language to learn, and like even though like some people you can't hear my accent, like I still have difficulty pronouncing some certain words too at certain times, and so like it's a constant struggle trying to learn the language, and this kind of club is something that will be useful for them as they grow up also.
Some of those kids at the very beginning, they didn't speak any English when they came in. So for them to be able to go on a video camera and talk about what they like is pretty amazing.
So I think that's that's really, I have a couple concluding comments there, but you can see we've expanded our offerings and supports, really concentrated on some of these engagement efforts that are on that list. I've already described that we just used to do more pull-out instruction. We're concentrating on doing more push-in instruction. We've learned to encourage the primary language over time, more emphasize that. Language is language, and it's actually the most important factor, and then how the new technologies are evolving and helping us out in this area. Another piece of it is, too, that we don't say it's English only, so we purchase books for students all the time in their native, maybe their stronger language, so that they can have both versions, and it could help them. So, and again, it's very related to standards-based because on the one hand, certainly these students have language goals, but they still have science goals, and they still have math goals. So in some ways, we want to say, like, if the standard is math, we want you to get to that math in any way. We're going to take down all barriers so you can access it, but we still want you working on your language, but you don't have to do the working on your language in sacrifice of continuing to work on your science. So we've gotten a lot clearer about that, and we try to help teachers locate those kinds of resources, or how can you translate it? What are the technologies that are going to help you translate it? So we're working all the time, training tutors, trying to work with teachers, showing them new kinds of resources, new ways of, and those are really universal design. So you've heard that, UDL principles. Those are really universal design kinds of access for all kinds of themes that we're always working on, trying to figure out so that we can eliminate some of these barriers for students so that they can get at the target. So. It's really a lot of work by a lot of people, and like I said, outstanding tutors, outstanding. I mean, I think you saw a list in here where it said, we have a 0.7 teacher who coordinates the program, provides training to tutors, provides coaching to teachers, develops and organizes curriculum materials, develops and runs outreach programs, and offers general support for anyone who has questions or needs advice. 0.7, that's and I don't think that's even a complete list. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I rely on her to do things. She runs around to all the schools. People see her at all the schools. She just finished helping make all the schedules for all the schools, and helps with the hiring, I mean, like everything. So thank goodness we have her. We're very lucky.
All right, well, thank you, Veronica, Nicole. I when I was looking at the list of languages, honestly, there was one or two I looked at with a somewhat furrowed brow. I'm like, okay, that's new to me. And
Like, that's a Google situation.
yeah, but you know, and what you're accomplishing with the program is great. But it's nice to see that our educational community is capitalizing on the diversity that surrounds them, and they're taking that in. So that's a wonderful benefit. Is sort of tangential that it's nice to see that that's being capitalized on. So, is there any questions? Yeah, Mark.
I do have one. What is Lost Links?
Yeah.
Is that a state test that's out there? Is that, I mean, this is what it's based all our measurements on. What is Lost Links?
So I don't know what it stands for, actually. I'm not sure what it is, but it's probably like a language assessment system or something like that. I made that up, but it's probably right.
Close enough.
But basically, it is, I think, I mean, originally, it was, somebody who had knowledge about how assessments work, made this test, and it was used in lots of different places nationally. And then the state of Connecticut adopted it as our test. So there's other tests. There's like a WIDA test is another example. What are some other tests? Well, we know WIDA.
They all use their own
Little acronyms for all these different tests, but Connecticut has adopted this Lost Links test, and it gives you 4 different scores, and then sort of combo scores, but one's in reading, one's in writing, one's in speaking and listening. So it's really the receptive, the 2 receptive, and then the 2 productive parts of language. And so then we get a score on each of them. So we have a placement test, and then what you're asking too is like, is this a state test? So no, our state didn't develop it, but it adopted this particular test for the purpose of identifying students who are ELL, and also for then testing out of the ELL program. So then
All schools are using this.
every Connecticut school uses this test. And then in that window between January and March, we test all these 155 students, plus whoever we get over the course of the year. No matter when they come, they will get tested in that January through March window, and that score will tell us whether or not they will continue in the program next year or whether they will exit the program. And then if they exit, they're still on a watch list for us for 2 years. We continue to communicate with teachers that they had been ELL, and so that they know that student may need certain supports that are additional than you would for an English native speaker. But yes, so it's a state test. The state didn't develop it, but this is the one they contract with in order to accomplish that.
And are we required to use it with the schools, or is this just, hey, this is who we use?
No, required. It's a requirement. It's in the state, law. So, and not only that, but while parents, just so you know, parents can opt out of our services. So that they get a letter, they say your child will be offered these. If you do not want to have us participate in these services, they can opt out. But they're really not allowed to opt out of the test. Mm-hmm. So they're supposed to be taking that test. And if they, if that were to happen, I mean, the student can't really get out. That ELL stays with them, because the only way to get out of it. I actually tried to talk to the state about, well, we have some students that met on ESPA, so can that be? And they said because it's not categorized as a English language test, it's a literacy test, that couldn't be a way to place out of intervention for ELL services. So that's a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you, Veronica. Thank you,
Thank you.
Nicole, appreciate it very much.
That's so much information.
I know. Like watching you all, I'm like reading the room, I'm like, but I can't really stop now.
Okay, next item on the agenda will be 5D, Engage Learning Update.
Okay, so we have lots of exciting updates. One, Ross Green came to Farmington. He's a nationally recognized author and speaker using the collaborative problem-solving model, and we've been using that in Farmington and with students that are having difficulty self-regulating behavior. Although bringing a national speaker often costs lots of money, Lori Weyerbeck helped Lori Singer with this, and we brought in people from other districts, and This is a great example of cost efficiency in that the tuition amounts for people to attend really covered the cost of the speaker. So that was really, a nice innovation that we've been doing now for a couple years. At East Farms, they're highlighting number talks. This is one of their focus areas for the year, and it's really about problem-solving math computations. At West District, they had a 3B day where it's be safe, be respectful, and be responsible. I think this next one is really exciting. 3 students from Westwoods placed second in the DXC code competition. 450 projects from 24 countries were submitted, and our students won second place. Really exciting there. And then purpose-driven learning at Westwoods. This was a collaboration. If you think back at Tara Vasquez, she presented elementary science units and having students do real-world type of science projects and inquiry-based science. And this is an example of our partnership with Winding Trails with one of our science units. International Day of Peace. This is something Noah Wallace does each year. Our art teacher really leads this, and just a wonderful example of contributing to a greater good and focusing on peace. FHS won gold from the Columbia Scholastic Press Association for their newspaper, The Voice. So there's a great picture of all of the contributors there to The Voice. And Union School, this is an example of flex time, both intervention and challenge. So we call it support and challenge block, being expanded from just Westwoods into our elementary schools, and it's going up into IAR as well. So Union highlighted their fly time, which is another name for flex time. So those are the updates for this board meeting.
Great, thank you. Very impressive as always.
Yeah.
Amazing accomplishments for our students. Okay, next item, 5E, professional appointments, retirements, resignations. There are none. Okay, next item, 6A, unfinished business, budget impact, budget update. Vince?
A couple of quick updates for the board. Mark is aware of the, because he was at the Bond Commission award, which is very exciting for the Go For project. There's a $50,000 bond award that's been awarded to the playground improvement project at Westwoods. I was just in contact with, they reached out to me, folks at DEEP. That's where the funds are going to come through their State Department to the town of Farmington, and then to the project. The next thing is on Friday we did put in our first submission for the security grant round 3. We put in for the material part of the submission, and when I called up to the state to check and make sure they got all of our paperwork, I talked to Eric Scoville at the state, who encouraged, told me about round 4, which the state is going to be doing a school security grant, sending out an application later this year, and encouraged us to apply for the next round, and which we will be doing, because we'll certainly have some projects that would qualify. I don't know if we'll get the award, but we will try to go after the 4th round too. And I just quickly had mentioned it's contracts. It's like renewal of contract type season that's coming up too. The district's electricity contract comes to a close on at the end of December. So I am working with CES, Competitive Energy Services, assisting me with going out and getting competitive bids for electricity contracts. Early look at some pricing is electricity rates are going up. But I'm going to go out a few times and see if we can't get, we're an attractive client to have, for a supplier, so we'll do our best, try to get the best deal we can. And then as the board's aware, the transportation contract is coming out.
That's great. Any questions for Ms. Mark?
Piggyback on that, for the bond hearing, for the hearing we went to, we were number 36 on the list of items. And so Vince and I got to spend a lot of time standing together, and the kids were very patient, sitting there watching our governor run the meeting. And it was a pretty impressive day. It was pretty nice.
Congratulations to you and Dave and everybody that worked on that project. It's a nice job. Nice job.
It's a big win for the district. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
It was a good
fantastic.
experience for all the students from Westwoods who went up there, I think, seeing that whole, that
Yeah, the
commission.
whole
Yeah.
commission take
Yeah.
place. And
it was a
seeing the
full
bond money.
room. There were a lot of people there.
There were a lot of people.
Interesting
I
event.
think it was a $75 million overall state grant hearing bonding. So there were a lot of people there for a lot of different projects.
Great job. Great job. Okay, any questions for Vince? Okay, thank you, Vince. Next item on the agenda, 7, new business. 7A, approval of the 2018-2019 school district annual report. Can I have a motion to approve?
Motion?
Second?
Okay, and?
It should say 7, right? 17, 18.
Oh, it said, I just read up there.
But we'll correct that.
Okay.
It's 17, 18, so it's a
I'm sorry.
reflection of last year.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
It's on the-
not you.
It's on the agenda.
It's on there.
So
it's
we should
17,
just correct. The motion is to approve the
Yes.
2017-2018 annual report.
Motion.
Okay.
Second.
All right.
So this is a reflection of last year, so much of this will be very familiar to you because it highlights some of, the accomplishments of last year, our assessment results, which we just went over. I will say that in the SAT assessment section, that is not yet available to us. So it says not yet available, but the town does keep us to this timeline. So we had to bring the report to you, and there had to be an approval tonight, even though we don't have those results yet. And I always ask you to look at the committees, make sure we did capture what occurred last year. Sometimes there might be slight changes there, but should be very familiar to the board.
Okay, any questions or comments? I mean, do we amend the report when we get the SAT information? or-
Yes,
Okay.
so I think this comes back to you a second time. For some reason, the town needs this right now as part of their timeline, but I do recall that we come back again to the
Okay.
board, so we will revisit this.
We will revisit, okay. Okay. Any questions or comments for Kathy on the report? Okay, the motion to approve the 2017-2018 school district annual report. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, thank you. 7B, review of the 2018 policy updates. If I can have a motion to approve the first reading of the 2018 policy updates.
Motion?
Second?
Okay, Christine, do you want to, anything, or you want to just go over them, or?
We can go through them. These are
this-
all legislative.
Yeah.
All legislative.
Yeah.
We went through them during our policy meeting. Some of it is just simple language changes. It's all highlighted for you. I don't know if we
Yeah.
need to go through all of them
No,
or
I
if you
mean,
want to. or-
Unless someone has a question, I have an explanation for each, but it really is a reflection of the legislative session last year.
Yeah.
And so some of them are very slight changes, and, but each one really reflects different legislative changes that happened in the last session.
So just to be clear, these are from this?
Correct, those are the
Yes.
policies.
Yes.
All right, and
Yes,
just
so
making
that
sure.
list
Yes.
is, yeah.
Okay.
They're all here.
Perfect. Just so I know. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, there's only one list. You're correct on, thank you.
and that's, all these attachments are, perfect.
Any questions or comments? Okay, the motion to approve the first reading of the 2018 policy updates, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Next item on the agenda, 8, consideration of the business administrator's report. Approval of the August 2018 financial report. If I could have a motion to approve the August 2018 financial report.
Motion?
Second?
Okay, Vince?
it's always really early, looking at July and August, combined financials that's traditionally presented to the board, because there's not very much activity that occurs in the month of July and then again in the month of August. And it's early for me to talk about any trends that we're seeing. I think it's I would say that it's to be expected, what I was looking at when we closed the month of August, and we compiled this. I'm just going to point out that if you starting on page 4, just as a note for the board, that when you see a federal grant or state grant, and you see dollars in there, and you have the double asterisk next to the category, that just represents that that is the award, the final award from the last fiscal year. And until I have new formal guidance, or we've brought in, or a grant award that's come in excess, or it's a final number, that's the only time I'll take off the double asterisks, and then you'll see a number there. So the MA Improved Thinking grant to Dr. Cofrancesco, which does not have double asterisks, that's the only one of the state grants that's actually come in and I have a formal award on. The rest are all based on last year's numbers.
Any questions or for Vince or comments? Okay, the motion to approve the July, August 2018 financial report, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Approved. Okay, next item, item 9, report of the board chair. Update of committee dates. Mark, we'll start with you, negotiations.
Next meeting is October 22nd, so we have a few weeks, so no update.
Communications. Ellen?
We are going to be interviewing a communications specialist.
Okay.
In a few weeks, so more to come on that.
They're going to
Any date?
announce the dates for that?
I think it's just the chair is going.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Just
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. Policy?
Nothing scheduled.
Nothing, okay. And curriculum?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, but I have a date out in January, I thought.
October.
We would have
Yeah,
a
we have
meeting
something-
before
so-
January.
Yeah. but the
That's
one-
what I was
yeah.
just looking. at my
October
guidance.
29th.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if
I think
have
it's
that on my
before the
calendar.
scheduled meeting on October 29th.
Yep, that's where it is, yep.
And then again in January.
Yes.
Thank you. Then 10B, draft of FHS facility one pager. You were at the, do you want to talk about this?
Sure.
Because I wasn't at that meeting, so.
So, and you can help me out as well. So we were asked by the Facility and Financial Ad Hoc Committee to come up with a one-pager of our statement of needs. So I did bring our statement of needs so that you would have it, because I know that it's so long ago. So it's hard to remember, but we did approve back in April 7th, 2015, an FHS statement of needs that reflected a facility review that we did. And then that was passed on to the town council. That's part of, we have ordinances in town that really dictate how building projects are brought forward and how they're managed over time through a building committee process. So this was the original statement of need that went to the town council, and they asked us to take that and create a one-pager from it. And so we did, and I just always want to keep the board in the loop when things like this are created, so that the board understands. If you saw that, you'd say, where did that come from? It's coming from the Facility and Financial Ad Hoc Committee that asked for this to be created. They've also created another document that is like a matrix of the statement of needs and some goals and a rating system. But for the purpose of tonight's conversation, I just wanted to make sure you had it. If you had any questions, I'd want you to have the opportunity to ask them. And, both the survey ad hoc and the other ad hoc are moving along in their process. We're getting close to a final survey from the survey ad hoc, and then from the facility and financial ad hoc. We're working, we've presented all of the reports and the surveys and studies and reviews that the building committee was able to see over time. We're going to be presenting the options that were presented to the building committee at the next committee meeting. We're also trying to engage another community that had a successful high school project to kind of get lessons learned from that community. And hopefully we would have a representative come and present to the committee, like what happened, like what was their success story, what did they do, and maybe that would help us with our process. But for now, just trying to give you the opportunity to give any feedback, and just know this goes back to the Facility and Financial Ad Hoc Committee at their next meeting, which I believe is October 16th.
Just a quick question.
Okay, yep, Andrea?
Yeah, what was the goal of having the one-pager? I mean, I like looking at the one-pager. It's a lot of information in one place. But what was the ask for? Like, what was the goal?
I think it was to try to understand the statement of needs, that this was a very complicated document and lots of words, and if you had to categorize it and try to put it in a one-pager so that anyone could, just take a look and say what were the big areas of need when it comes to the high school, I think it was more like of a communication tool. I envision that by the time this ad hoc finishes, it would almost be like a list of recommendations and maybe a package, a communication type of package. That's what I envision. But I do know that that's part of the process. We have created a timeline for both committees that we will talk to both committees about. But in the end, I think Christine is the one who brought it up at the last meeting, like, what are the deliverables? We need to really get a handle on the deliverables so we know what we're working on and what we're going to present by the end of the process.
The objectives seem to be very broad. So you hear communication we're talking about. The finances haven't really come into play that much, although we may get into that a little bit at some point. So this was created, like Kathy said, more along the lines of like a communication to the public at some point, but it's unclear as to when that would take place or where it would be delivered to. Our deliverables are definitely an issue that we're trying to work through.
Yeah, because this is something that's definitely more user-friendly, easier to look at than picking this up and trying to interpret this.
It reads like almost like a legal document with a lot of whereases and stuff.
Yeah.
Do we feel that this captures in its totality the statement of needs?
I believe so. I think that we tried to, take the whereas out and really tried to bucket it.
Yeah.
It's like, this is what we need.
Yeah.
Seriously.
No, it's like, this could be a marketing tool.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
And I think, when the statement of need was first established, these were the needs. And I think, I don't know, myself, I still feel very strongly about all of the needs. So I'm curious about the matrix. And you mentioned a ranking of the statement of need. Where is that going and who is ranking?
So
I don't understand that because these are all the needs. I don't understand the need for a ranking.
So I think that's something that, Chris is going to talk to Edward, who is leading the facility and financial ad hoc, because there is a question about, the board has brought forward this statement of need. It was approved, it was sent on, and, is it appropriate for us to prioritize and not really having, this document is something that was created, within the committee. So I don't know. I know.
No, I haven't spoken to Edward yet, but I'm going to speak to Edward about that. So I'll report back on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, all right,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, next item, 10, executive session. Can I have a motion?
We don't have
Oh, we don't? You don't? Okay, wasn't sure. Okay, well then we'll take that off. And then Item 11, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? We're adjourned.